The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, and I knew before I opened it that my life was about to burn down. Not because there was anything sinister about the envelope, it was cream-colored, professional, unremarkable, but because I recognized the handwriting. My sister Margaret. She hadn't written me by hand in 17 years. We communicated by text, by email, by the occasional forced phone call on Christmas. Margaret didn't use pen and paper. Margaret didn't reach back into the past. And yet here she was, reaching. I was sitting in my office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian building, the same office I'd occupied for the past 8 years, the office that had become both my greatest achievement and my most elaborate prison. The morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, and for 32 years, this view had meant something to me. Success, arrival, the confirmation that I'd made the right choices, that I'd built something lasting, that I was, by the standards of the world I inhabited, a man of consequence. I was 48 years old then. My body had begun its quiet betrayal 6 or 7 years prior, small rebellions, my back aching after golf, my knees protesting stairs, the weight that no longer came off after a few disciplined weeks at the gym. My hair, what remained of it, had turned silver with surprising thoroughness, and I'd stopped fighting it, embraced it even, worn it as the uniform of a man who'd lived long enough to earn his graying. I told myself this was confidence. Looking back now, I understand it was simply resignation to the inevitability of aging, a surrender to physics I couldn't negotiate with. I had been married once, badly, for 3 years. The marriage produced nothing but legal fees and the kind of bitter indifference that eventually calcifies into something almost peaceful. There were no children from that union, and while Sarah, my ex-wife, had moved on to someone more emotionally available, more present, I had not. Instead, I poured myself into work with the single-minded obsession of someone trying to prove something to the universe. To my parents, perhaps? To myself. To the version of the 17-year-old Harrison who'd looked at the world and decided he would become someone important. I'd succeeded beyond almost any reasonable measure. Senior Vice President of Operations at Rothstein & Cole, one of the most prestigious financial consulting firms on the East Coast. Salary that had entered the low 7 figures 5 years ago and had been climbing ever since. A penthouse apartment in the Upper West Side. A car I barely drove. Recognition at industry events. Board memberships. The kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. The kind of life I'd been conditioning myself to want since I was young enough to believe that external accomplishment could fill the spaces inside where other people had meaning. But something had changed 3 months before that letter arrived. Something had shifted in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Something that made the morning commute feel heavier and the evening work sessions feel emptier. I'd attributed it to the natural malaise of a man in his late 40s, that particular species of disillusionment that comes from realizing you've achieved nearly everything you set out to achieve and it hasn't filled the void you thought it would. My therapist, I had started seeing a therapist 6 months prior, something I'd always considered a weakness until I realized I was having the same conversations with myself over and over, getting no closer to answers, suggested. I was experiencing what she called success grief, the mourning of all the possibilities you killed when you committed to one singular path. I didn't buy it, not entirely. There was something more specific, more pointed than that. There was a feeling that something in the architecture of my life was wrong, that I'd been solving the wrong equation for 30 years. The letter sat on my desk. I kept looking at it, the way you might look at an animal you're not sure is dead. Margaret's handwriting was smaller than I remembered it, the letters more cramped. The envelope had been addressed in blue ink. Inside, I could see 3 pages, maybe 4. "Come on," I said aloud, which was something I'd been doing lately, talking to myself in the office when no one was around. I was doing it more and more. These small utterances of encouragement or complaint, or just the sound of my own voice confirming that I still existed. I opened the envelope. The letter began without preamble. Harrison, I am writing to you because I can no longer live with what we did. I am 62 years old now. I have 3 months, maybe 4, and I need you to know the truth before I die. The truth about what happened. The truth about why. My vision tilted slightly. I set the letter down. I picked it up again. Margaret had cancer. I knew that. I'd known for 2 years. The family, my mother, my brother David, myself, we'd been told it was manageable, that her doctors were optimistic, that she would likely have several more good years. Likely. Such a word. I thought about how many conversations I'd had with her where she'd said she was doing well, and how I'd accepted this at face value, grateful not to have to interrogate it further, not to have to sit with the weight of her mortality. I kept reading. When we were young, before you became whoever you decided to be, we were close. You protected me. When David would be cruel, when the other kids would exclude me, you stood with me. You held my hand. Do you remember that? Do you remember the lake house when you were 14 and I was 11? And someone said something terrible and you walked out to find them and came back with a bruise on your jaw. I never told anyone it was you who did that. I let them believe it was an accident. I protected you, the way you had protected me. That's what siblings do. That's what love is. There was more. So much more. Her handwriting seemed to grow even smaller as the letter progressed, as if the effort of revelation was physically diminishing her, draining her. What happened 30 years ago wasn't an accident. You know that now, I think. That's why you're struggling. That's why the success feels hollow. That's why you wake up and wonder if it was worth it. I need you to know that I remember. I remember, and I'm sorry, and I should have spoken sooner. I read the letter twice. Then I sat in the silence of my office for 40 minutes, watching the city move past the windows, watching cars navigate the streets below, watching people live their lives in ways that seemed to possess a clarity I'd lost somewhere along the way. My assistant knocked on my door at 11:47 a.m. I didn't respond immediately, so she opened it anyway, the way she always did, the way I'd long since given up trying to prevent. You have a conference call with the Denver office in 13 minutes, Rachel said. She was 31, competent, relentlessly cheerful in a way that made me feel ancient. She'd worked for me for 3 years and still treated me with a careful respect, usually reserved for people who were either very important or slightly dangerous. I was both, I supposed. Cancel it, I said. The meeting? Yes, all of today. Push the meetings to next week if they're important. Reschedule the rest. Rachel's face showed the careful negotiation of someone trying to determine if this was a joke or a crisis. Is everything okay? No, I said. Everything is not okay. But I will be back tomorrow. Tell them it's a personal matter. She left, and I sat with Margaret's letter and realized that I was having the first entirely honest moment I'd allowed myself in months. Possibly years. Nothing was okay. And nothing had been okay for a very, very long time. I was 17 years old when it happened. The thing that Margaret had alluded to, the thing that had set the trajectory for all the years that followed. Our family lived in Connecticut then, in a house that my father had described as understated affluence, which meant it was worth approximately 4 times what the average house in the area sold for, but the decorating was expensive in a way that didn't advertise itself. My father was a partner at a law firm. My mother was a patron of various arts organizations and had raised fundraising to an art form that bordered on performance art. Margaret was 14 and beautiful in a way that made her invisible to herself, which is often the most dangerous kind of beauty. David was 20 and had already internalized my father's philosophy about the world, that it was a hierarchical system where certain people won and others lost. And there was no shame in being a winner as long as you didn't pretend the losers mattered. I was 17, and I had just been accepted to Yale early decision. This was November. My father had taken me out to dinner to celebrate, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant that required a jacket and had prices you had to ask about. He'd ordered wine, a celebration of my admission or a celebration of his own wisdom in producing a son capable of Ivy League acceptance. I was never quite sure which. He'd put his hand on my shoulder in the restaurant, in front of other people, in a way he rarely did, and I'd felt a spike of something like pride mixed with the disturbing realization that this moment, this paternal acknowledgement, was worth more to me than it should be. "You've made me very proud," he'd said. "You understand what this means, don't you? This is the beginning of real life. This is where everything that matters happens." I had understood, or I had believed I understood. I had been trained since childhood to understand it. The world was a meritocracy, or so we were told, and if you were smart enough and worked hard enough, you would rise. This was the American narrative we inhabited, the story we told ourselves at dinner tables and at school assemblies. My father had risen. He was proof. And now I was rising, trajectory already established. What I didn't understand, what I wouldn't understand for another 30 years, was that my father's version of success had been purchased with a specific currency, one he paid so routinely that he'd stopped seeing the transaction. 3 weeks after my Yale acceptance, something happened at school that would alter the course of everything. There was a girl named Amber Rothstein, daughter of Richard Rothstein, the founder and CEO of Rothstein & Cole, the consulting firm that would eventually become my employer. Amber was 17 like me, a senior, and she had the specific kind of power that comes from wealth combined with social fluency. She wasn't the most beautiful girl at the school, there were prettier ones, but she was the most untouchable, the one who set the standards that everyone else scrambled to meet. I had never spoken to Amber Rothstein directly. She existed in my world the way distant constellations exist, visible, mapped, but fundamentally separate. I was smart, I was academically accomplished, but I was not in her social stratum. I was not the child of titans of industry. My father was impressive in his way, but he was a lawyer. That was respectable, but it wasn't visionary. It wasn't the kind of wealth that came from building empires. And then, in December of that year, something shifted. I was recruited, and that's the only word that makes sense for what happened. Recruited by Amber's closest friend, a girl named Chloe Patterson, to be a tutor for Amber in advanced chemistry. Amber was struggling, apparently. Her parents were concerned. There was a fee involved, a substantial one. I would come to the Rothstein house twice a week and help her prepare for her midterm exam. I was 17 and stupid in the way that only 17-year-old boys can be stupid with sex just beginning to become a reality rather than an abstraction. Stupid with the hunger for social elevation. Stupid with the intoxication of being chosen for something. Even if I couldn't quite articulate why I'd been chosen or by whom, my mother was thrilled. "This would look good on my college applications," she said. Not that I needed anything else to look good on my applications. Yale had already accepted me, but it was the principle of the thing. It showed initiative. It showed I was the kind of person who could navigate complex social situations. What I understand now, what took me 30 years to fully comprehend, is that I was being positioned, arranged, that everything that followed had been orchestrated with a kind of precision that only comes when you're working with specific goals in mind. Specific goals that had nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with the future architecture of power. I went to the Rothstein house for the first tutoring session on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. The house was in a different world from our own, which was itself already considerably above the world of most people. This was the kind of wealth that didn't have to announce itself, that had transcended the need for ostentation. It was the mansion at the end of a long drive, the kind of place where winter made the landscape look like it had been designed by someone who understood composition and negative space. Amber was waiting in the study on the second floor, a room with a view of the grounds and leather furniture that smelled like money, in the way that specific textures and investments create a particular kind of scent. She was wearing a sweater that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill, and her hair was in a configuration that had required some kind of styling that I recognized but couldn't replicate in description. "Thank you for coming," she'd said, and the formality of it was strange, as if this was a business meeting rather than a tutoring session. "I really appreciate it. I know you're probably busy." "No, I mean, it's fine," I'd said, in the inarticulate way of nervous 17-year-old boys. "I'm happy to help." And I had helped. I'm not misremembering that part. I was a good tutor. I understood chemistry in the intuitive way that some people understand systems, and I knew how to break down concepts into their constituent parts and reassemble them in ways that made sense. Amber was not actually stupid. I understood that fairly quickly. She was distracted, unfocused, the product of a childhood where she'd been told so many times that she didn't have to excel that she'd internalized it, made it a kind of defiant stance against the pressure of expectation. She was bright enough, though. The circuits were there. By the third session, she was paying less attention to chemistry and more attention to me, asking questions about my life. Where I wanted to go to college, I told her Yale. What I wanted to do with my life, I hadn't known then. Not really. I just said something about business because it seemed to be the appropriate response. Had I ever been to the city? Had I ever thought about moving to New York? Did I like parties? The tutoring continued through December and into January. The chemistry exam came and went. Amber got an A. I was congratulated by her parents at a Christmas party we were invited to. My parents were invited to a Christmas party at the Rothstein house, which was an event of significant social import in our town. Richard Rothstein had shaken my hand and told me I was exactly the kind of young man they needed more of. I was 17, and I'd interpreted this as praise for my academic talents, my tutoring skills. I was 17, and I was phenomenally naive about what adults meant when they said the things they said. The tutoring continued even after the exam. This was unusual, but I didn't question it. The pay was good, very good for a teenager in the late 1990s, and, more importantly, I was getting access to a world I'd been trained since birth to want. The Rothstein house became a kind of second home. Sometimes, I would arrive for a tutoring session, and Amber wouldn't be there. Some prior commitment had come up, but Richard would ask me to wait, to have a drink with him in his study, and he would talk to me about business, about the consulting world, about what it took to be successful in the modern economy. He asked me questions about Yale, about what I was thinking about studying, about my ambitions. I remember, vividly, one conversation in particular. It was late January, and there was snow on the ground. Richard had dismissed Amber for the afternoon. "Go do something fun, sweetheart," and had invited me to stay. We sat in his study, the same room where I'd tutored his daughter, and he'd poured us each a glass of scotch. I was 17. I'd never had scotch. I hated it, and I drank it anyway because Richard Rothstein had poured it for me. And there was something in that gesture that felt like an initiation, a crossing over into the category of people who drank scotch and talked about adult things. "I've been watching you," he said. Not in a predatory way, I want to be clear about that. But that's how you know something is predatory, when someone has to explicitly state that it isn't. You're a remarkable young man. Your grades, your test scores, your acceptance to Yale, these are all impressive. But what's more impressive to me is your quality of character. You're not arrogant about your intelligence. You're not dismissive of people. You listen more than you speak. Those are rare qualities in someone your age. Rarer still in someone your background. I think I hoped then, and I wonder now if this was actually true. I think he was testing me. Testing to see if I would challenge him on the last part, on the implication that being from a family of lawyers and doctors and minor league socialites somehow meant I had the capacity for the things he apparently valued. I didn't challenge him. I accepted the compliment as though it didn't come wrapped in the kind of subtle classism that I should have. Recognized but didn't. "Thank you, sir," I'd said. "Richard, please. We're going to know each other for a long time." He was right about that, though not in the way he meant it. I want to offer you something, he continued. A position. Not formal, not yet. But I've been thinking about your future, and I think you could be of tremendous use to me. To Rothstein and Cole. We do a lot of work in the finance sector, and we're always looking for people with financial backgrounds or the capacity to think like a financier. Before college, before Yale trains you to think a particular way, and Yale will train you. Don't mistake that. Those institutions have a way of taking raw intelligence and channeling it into very particular shapes. I'd like to give you a look at what actual business looks like. Summer internship. We'll pay you extraordinarily well. You'll see how the world really works, not the theoretical version they teach you, but the actual version. The version that matters. I was 17 and I was being offered a glimpse of a future that seemed to have been designed specifically for me, built to my exact specifications. I was being told that my intelligence and character were valuable, that I had a place in the world that was already waiting for me, that if I was smart and listened carefully, I could have everything I'd been trained since birth to want. That's incredibly generous, I said. It's an investment, he corrected gently. I don't do anything out of pure generosity. I'm a businessman. I see potential, and I invest in it. Sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. But in your case, I think it will. I left his study and found Amber in the kitchen, sitting on one of the high stools at the marble counter, eating yogurt out of a glass container. She looked up at me, and there was something in her expression that I misread, or perhaps read correctly but chose to misinterpret. Something knowing. Something that suggested she already knew what her father had offered me, that she'd perhaps been consultant about it. So? She asked. So what? So? Did he recruit you? Did you take the bait? It's not bait, I said, defensive. It's an opportunity. It's the same thing, Amber said, setting down her yogurt. It's how my dad works. He finds smart people who want things, and he gives them the things they want, and then they owe him. Not explicitly. It's never explicit. But you're smart enough to understand that. You're too smart not to. That's a pretty cynical way of looking at it, I said, but even then, even at 17, I felt the warning in her words, the fact that she was trying to tell me something. I'm not trying to be cynical. I'm trying to save you a lot of trouble, she said, but I don't think it works like that. I think you have to walk into it on your own. I think watching other people walk into it doesn't help. Are you saying I shouldn't take the internship? I asked. She shrugged. I'm saying you should know what you're walking into, but I don't think you do. I don't think any of us do, really. Not until it's too late. The internship began in June of that year, summer before I left for Yale. It was my first real job, my first real look at the world of high-level finance and consulting. Rothstein and Cole occupied most of the 35th through 40th floors of a building in Manhattan. The office was intimidating in ways that I now understand were designed to be intimidating, the kind of space that tells you the moment you walk in that you are in the presence of people who are better than you, smarter than you, more connected than you. The partners walked like they owned the building because in a sense they did. The junior consultants hustled in and out with the kind of frantic energy that comes from trying to seem indispensable. The administrative staff maintained the machinery of the operation with a kind of invisible efficiency. I was assigned to a senior consultant named James Park, who took me under his wing in the way that mentors do when they're being paid to do so, which James essentially was training me was part of his job. He was in his late 30s, Korean American, the kind of person who had clearly achieved success and then struggled with what to do with that success. He had kind eyes and a way of explaining things that made complex systems seem navigable. The thing you need to understand, James told me on my first day, walking me through the office, showing me to my desk, a real desk, not a corner somewhere, is that consulting is about stories. Everyone thinks it's about numbers or data or analysis. It's not. Well, it is. But primarily, it's about stories. We tell stories about companies, about industries, about the future. We make these stories sound very authoritative because we have data and charts and a bunch of people with degrees from good schools. But essentially, we're storytellers. We're professional storytellers who get paid enormous amounts of money to tell stories that people with power want to hear. What kind of stories? I asked. All kinds. We tell stories about why a company is failing and what they need to do to fix it. We tell stories about why an acquisition would be smart or disastrous. We tell stories about market trends and what that means for where to invest capital. We tell stories that justify decisions that have already been made. He paused. That last one is the most important. That last one is where the real money is. Companies come to us not to tell them what they should do. They come to us to tell them why what they already want to do is the right thing to do. I was 19 years old. I'd aged 2 years since the tutoring had begun, but only in the accounting sense. Psychologically and emotionally, I was exactly where I'd been when I walked into the Rothstein house for the first time, though perhaps slightly more calcified in my naivete. James was telling me something important, something true about how the world really worked, and I was storing it away in some corner of my consciousness, but not really integrating it. I was too caught up in the thrill of being in that space, of being treated like I belonged there, even though we all knew I didn't, not really. I was 19, I was smart, I was going to Yale, and I was being told by powerful people that I was special. My job that summer was primarily observational. I attended meetings and said nothing. I read reports and took notes. I watched how decisions were made. Watched how power operated in a space where everyone had degrees from Ivy League schools and connections to important people. I watched and I absorbed, in the unconscious way that young people do, learning the codes and the language and the internal logic of a world I decided I wanted to be part of. One project in particular stands out. We'd been engaged by a manufacturing company called Prestige Industries, family-owned for 3 generations, 300 employees spread across 3 facilities in the Northeast. The company was struggling debt accumulation, declining market share, management that was aging and unable to adapt to changing market conditions. The official story that Rothstein and Cole was brought in to evaluate was this: what should Prestige Industries do to remain competitive? Could they be saved? If so, how? The real story was different. Richard Rothstein had made a deal with one of Prestige Industries' board members, a man named Walter Chun, who'd been brought on to the board 5 years prior and who had very different ideas about what should happen to the company than the founders and long-term employees did. Walter Chun believed that Prestige Industries should be broken up, that the assets should be sold separately, that the 3 facilities should be shuttered, and that the company's intellectual property should be acquired by a much larger manufacturing conglomerate. He believed this because he had already made an arrangement with that larger conglomerate to buy the IP at a very favorable rate, and once the deal was struck, he would benefit substantially. And he'd brought Rothstein and Cole in to provide the authoritative analysis that would convince the board that his plan was the only rational choice. I didn't know all of this at first. I learned it slowly, in pieces, the way you learn things when you're observing a complex system and starting to recognize the patterns. The first report came back negative. Prestige Industries was in structural decline. The debt was too high, the management was too entrenched, the market headwinds were too strong. The recommendation was liquidation. Get out while you still can. Sell the assets. End of story. This report was presented to the board in a meeting that I attended. I sat in the back of the conference room, taking notes on a legal pad. Richard Rothstein presented it himself, which was unusual. He was the CEO now, had been for 15 years, but typically he had the senior consultants deliver these kinds of reports. But this one, he wanted to do himself. I think he wanted to look the founders of Prestige Industries in the eye and deliver the verdict that would end their legacy. I remember Peter Falcone, one of the founders, asking a question. He was in his 70s by that point, silver-haired, exhausted. "But we've been successful for 30 years, he said. "Our products are good. People buy them. We've navigated downturns before. Is there any scenario where we don't sell?" Richard had smiled, and this is the part that I remember most vividly, the specific quality of that smile. It was a smile of pity and contempt mixed with just enough false sympathy to maintain plausible deniability. It was the smile of someone delivering a verdict that he'd already decided upon before all the analysis had been done, before any of the data had been gathered. It was the smile of someone who was orchestrating an outcome and who'd decided that this outcome was best served by positioning it as inevitable, as the only rational choice. The scenario where you don't sell is the scenario where you're comfortable presiding over your company's slow decline, Richard had said. Where you're comfortable watching your employees get laid off one by one. Where you're comfortable sitting with debt that will eventually force the bank to take action anyway. But by then, you'll have even less leverage than you have now. The scenario where you don't sell is the scenario where you lie to yourself about what's happening in the world around you. And I don't think you're the kind of people who lie to yourselves, are you? He was manipulating them, and he was manipulating them with such skill that it barely looked like manipulation. It looked like sense. It looked like rational analysis. It looked like the only possible conclusion. The board voted to accept the recommendation 2 weeks later. The asset sale process began. Within 6 months, the company had been dismantled. The facilities were shuttered. The 300 employees were laid off. The intellectual property was sold to the larger manufacturer at a price that was considerably higher than what Prestige Industries would have received had they tried to sell it themselves, meaning that somewhere in that transaction, money was being made by the people who had engineered the deal. I didn't understand the full scope of what had happened. Not then. I was 19, I was seeing how the world worked, and what I was learning was that the world worked through orchestration, through the careful arrangement of outcomes that appeared inevitable but were actually constructed. I was learning that my job, eventually, would be to help construct these outcomes, to tell the stories that justified them, to provide the analytical cover that made manipulation look like wisdom. By the end of that summer, I had been offered a job, not for the future, not as some vague possibility, but for the present. For after I graduated from Yale, they wanted me in the consulting pipeline, they said. They saw tremendous potential. They wanted to mentor me, to shape my career. I would be a senior consultant within 5 years, a partner within 12, a man of real influence and power. I said yes. But before Yale, before I could say yes with the kind of formality they wanted, something happened. Something that changed everything or didn't change anything, depending on how you look at it. Something that I've spent the last 30 years trying to convince myself didn't matter. That was a regrettable incident, a youthful indiscretion, a thing that I was not personally responsible for. I was back home for the rest of the summer after the internship ended. My family was, in many ways, relieved. I'd achieved everything I was supposed to achieve. Yale. A job waiting for me when I graduated. A trajectory that was clear and ascending. My parents threw a dinner party in August, inviting people to celebrate my success. The Rothsteins came. The Pattersons. Various doctors and lawyers and business people from our town who existed in the same social stratum. And Amber was there, home from her first year of college at Penn, tanned and more beautiful and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from having discovered that the world was constructed specifically to reward her. I didn't speak to her much that evening. I was aware of her in the way you're aware of a magnet if you're made of metal. There's a pull, a disturbance in your internal field, but you can choose not to orient yourself toward it, and I was trying not to. I was dating someone then, a girl named Jessica from school. A nice girl, a smart girl, someone who represented stability and normalcy. She was at the dinner party with me, holding my hand, complicit in the narrative we were constructing together about who we were and what our future would look like. Later in the evening, I found myself outside on the back patio, smoking a cigarette I smoked then briefly, in the way that upper-middle-class kids do when they're trying to seem sophisticated, and Amber came out to find me. Or I like to tell myself it was happenstance, that she came out to get away from the noise and we happened to encounter each other. But the truth is more complicated. The truth is that I knew, at some level, that she would come find me. The truth is that I wanted her to. "Hi," she said, standing close enough to me that I could smell her shampoo, something expensive and particular. "You've been avoiding me." "I haven't been avoiding you," I said, but I had been, and she knew it. "You're dating Jessica," she said, not a question. "Yes, Jessica is a perfectly nice person," Amber said. "I've always liked her, but she's not right for you." "How would you know what's right for me?" I asked, but I was already leaning toward her, already orienting myself in her direction, already making the choices that would lead to everything that followed. "Because I'm right for you," she said, and she kissed me. Right there on the patio, where anyone inside could see through the glass doors, could witness exactly what was happening. And I kissed her back, because I was 19 and she was 19 and she was beautiful and she was touching me and nothing else mattered. The kiss lasted maybe 5 seconds, an eternity, a microsecond. Time moved differently around Amber. It had always moved differently around her. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, pulling back but staying close. "And I'm going to tell you because you need to know and because I won't get another chance. My father is not who you think he is. He's been planning this for a while, planning you, I mean. Not in a sinister way, not exactly, but strategically. He does that. He finds people and he positions them. He's done it to everyone in his company. He finds smart people with nothing and he gives them everything they could possibly want, and then they belong to him. They think they're successful, and technically they are, but they're successful in his direction. They're pieces on his board." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, but I did. I knew exactly what she was talking about, and I didn't want to know it. And the fact that she was saying it out loud was making it real in a way I wasn't ready for. "You're going to go to Yale," she continued. "You're going to graduate. You're going to come work for him. And you're going to spend the next 30 years getting richer and more successful and more trapped in a system that you didn't build, and that doesn't serve anyone except the people at the very top. You're going to make more money than you ever thought possible. You're going to live in nice apartments and nice neighborhoods. You're going to tell yourself that you're successful, that you've made it. And one day, maybe when you're my age, maybe when you're older, you're going to wake up and realize that you sold something you can't get back, that you accepted a deal that looked good at the time but that had costs you didn't understand. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I love you, she said. I think I always have. Since you came to tutor me in chemistry, since the first moment I saw you sitting at that desk and understood what my father was doing. And because I'm trying to warn you, I'm trying to give you a chance to opt out before you get so deep that opting out becomes impossible. I don't want to opt out, I said. I want to do this. I want to be successful. I know, she said sadly. That's why it won't matter that I told you. Jessica came out onto the patio then, found Amber and me standing too close together, and understood exactly what had just happened. She didn't say anything. She just set down her drink and walked back into the house. I watched her go, understanding in some visceral way that I just made a choice, that I just step off a path that had been smooth and safe and into something more complicated. I didn't regret it. Even then, even at 19, knowing that I was probably making a mistake, I didn't regret it. But that's not the incident. That's not the thing that Margaret alluded to in her letter. That kiss, that moment of choosing Amber, that was just the opening gesture in a symphony of bad decisions that would follow. What happened was this. Amber broke up with me a month before I left for Yale. She did it cleanly, with the kind of directness that suggested she'd practiced the speech. She said she cared about me, but that we wanted different things. She said she'd wanted to warn me and I hadn't listened, and she didn't think she could be with someone who wouldn't listen. She said she was going back to school at Penn and that she needed to focus on her own path. None of this was untrue. All of it was, however, beside the point. The point was this. A week after Amber broke up with me, 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave for Yale, I received a phone call from my father. He was at work, calling from his office. He asked me to meet him at his club for dinner. This was unusual. My father didn't typically invite me to his club. This was a space that was coded as male, as exclusive, as existing in the world of serious business and serious money. I was going to Yale. I was not yet part of this world. But apparently, I was about to be. "I've received some information," my father said once we were seated, once the appetizers had been ordered, once we'd gone through the ritualistic portion of the dinner where you establish that you're comfortable being in this space together. "Information that I thought you should be aware of. It concerns Amber Rothstein." I felt my stomach tighten. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew it was bad. The specificity of his tone, the fact that he'd wanted to speak to me privately, in this club, away from my mother and my siblings, this all pointed toward something that couldn't be said casually, something that required formal space and formality and distance. "What kind of information?" I asked. "She's been involved in a situation with one of her professors," my father said. "A professor at Penn. The situation became inappropriate. She's been threatening to report it, or she was, and then she decided against it. The professor in question has very important connections to people in business, people who matter in this world. Rothstein knows about this. He knows about it, and he's asked me to talk to you." "To talk to me about what?" I asked, though I think I already knew. I think some part of me had always known. "To ask you not to pursue contact with Amber. To understand that any connection to her, any public association with her, could be complicated. For your future, for your prospects, for your career. Rothstein values you tremendously, and he wants to see you succeed. But he also needs to be able to manage certain aspects of his family situation, and your cooperation would be valuable to him. And to your future." I remember the waiter coming by. I remember my father ordering fish. I remember the ambient noise of the club, other important men having important conversations in low voices. I remember understanding, with a kind of internal click, that I was being shown the architecture of how the world worked. Not just told, not just introduced to the concept in the abstract, but shown the specific mechanics of leverage and power and the way that one person's compromised situation could be weaponized to secure the compliance of another. And I remember most importantly, agreeing. I said, yes, of course I understood. I said Amber and I were broken up anyway, so this wasn't even asking very much of me. I said I wouldn't contact her. I said I understood the importance of being discreet about the situation, of not mentioning it to anyone, of not allowing this information to become public in any way. I agreed to all of this, not because I was forced to, but because I understood, in the way that smart people understand things, that my agreement was the only rational response to the situation I'd been presented with. What I didn't understand, what I wouldn't understand for 30 years, was that I'd just been initiated into the machinery. I had just been shown that I was willing to participate in something corrupt in exchange for access and security. I had been presented with a test, and I had passed it by failing in exactly the way that I was supposed to fail. After dinner, my father walked me to the car. He put his hand on my shoulder, the same way he had when we'd celebrated my Yale acceptance, except this time the gesture felt different. This time it felt like a hand reaching into my chest and taking something essential. Some part of me that had thought I was fundamentally a good person who would do the right thing when faced with a genuine choice. He'd taken that part and replaced it with something else, survival instinct, perhaps, or ambition, or the understanding that in order to succeed in this world, you had to be willing to compromise, to make deals, to accept that doing the right thing was often incompatible with getting ahead. "You're going to do very well," he said. I've never been more confident of that. What he meant was, you are the kind of person who will sacrifice your principles when the stakes are high enough. You are the kind of person who can be managed. You are exactly the kind of person we need. I left for Yale 3 weeks later. I didn't contact Amber. I didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her, didn't reach out when I heard she transferred schools. I participated in the silence that had been engineered around her situation, and I told myself that this wasn't a betrayal, this was just how the world worked. This was just how you got ahead. This was just part of the price. Margaret died a month after I received her letter. I went to see her in the hospital 3 days before the end, and we spoke about the past. She was in a hospice facility in a bed that could be adjusted with buttons under blankets that were designed specifically for dying people. Her appearance had changed dramatically in the months since I'd seen her last. She was smaller, diminished, but her eyes were still present, still seeing, still understanding. "I'm sorry," she said to me, "for the letter, for making this your burden." "It's not a burden," I said, which was a lie. It was exactly a burden. She was asking me to hold something, to carry something, to integrate something into my understanding of my own history that would change me, that had already changed me. "It is," she said with certainty, "and I'm sorry. But I couldn't die without telling you, without making sure that you understood that I knew, that I remembered, that I was complicit too, in a different way. I was complicit when you agreed not to contact Amber. I was complicit when I didn't stand up for what was right. I was complicit when I watched you become successful and didn't ask what that success was built on. You were a kid," I said. "You couldn't have done anything." "I was a kid then," she agreed. "But I wasn't always a kid. I became an adult. And I had the opportunity to speak, and I didn't. I chose not to. Every day for 30 years, I chose not to speak. And now I'm running out of days, so I'm speaking. But I'm doing it from a hospice bed, which feels appropriate. I'm speaking too late to change anything except your understanding of what happened." I held her hand. Her skin was papery, fragile, a texture that reminded me of how temporary we all are, how quickly the body gives up, how little time any of us really have to get things right. "Is she okay?" I asked. "Amber? Do you know what happened to her? She's fine. She got out, I think. She left the family business completely. She lives in California now. She's a therapist. She helps people figure out what they've been damaged by." "That's good," I said. "It is," Margaret said, "but it doesn't change what happened to you. It doesn't change what happened to a lot of people because someone decided that their success was more important than anyone else's integrity." She died 3 days later. I was there when it happened, along with my mother and my brother David, who had himself become a lawyer and who had replicated many of my father's patterns with remarkable precision. David held her hand on the other side while my mother sat at the foot of the bed and I sat where I'd been sitting, and we all watched her move from life into whatever comes next. The funeral was large. She had lived a long time. She had done good work. She had been a teacher, had shaped hundreds of young people, had lived a life that was quieter than mine but in many ways more substantial. The obituary mentioned her contributions to education, her volunteer work, her family. It didn't mention the letter. It didn't mention the things she'd been holding for 30 years. Those things died with her, or they passed into me, into the story I would have to figure out how to carry. I took a leave of absence from work after Margaret's funeral. This was something I'd never done before. My entire career at Rothstein and Cole had been built on the understanding that I was the kind of person who didn't take leaves of absence. I was the person who came in even when I was sick. I was the person who worked through holidays. I was the person who had sublimated my personal life into the machinery of success. A month of personal leave seemed not just indulgent but incomprehensible. But I took it anyway. I told Richard Rothstein had become a friend by that point, or at least he had become the person I saw most regularly that I needed time. He was sympathetic. He told me to take whatever time I needed. He told me that the firm would be fine. He told me that I'd earned the rest. What he didn't do was ask why. What he didn't do was inquire into what I was actually going to do with that time. What he didn't do was acknowledge that something in me had shifted, that the architecture of my compliance had developed a crack. I spent the first week of my leave in the apartment I'd maintained in Manhattan since I'd graduated from Yale. I'd moved back to the city the year after I graduated. Had taken an apartment on the Upper East Side, had established myself in the geography of the consulting world. The apartment was nice, expensively furnished, decorated by someone I'd hired to make it look like I had taste, but it had never really felt like home. It felt like a set, like a place where I performed the character of a successful consultant named Harrison Blake. I didn't leave the apartment much that first week. I sat on the couch. I looked at the city from the windows. I thought about Margaret, about what she'd been trying to tell me. I thought about Amber, who had gotten out, who had somehow understood at 19 what it would take me until nearly 50 to understand, that the world I'd chosen to be part of was a machinery designed to consume meaning, to turn integrity into commodity, to exchange a person's essential self for money and status and power. On the 8th day of my leave, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I searched for Amber Rothstein online. This was easy now in a way it wouldn't have been 30 years ago. Information was available instantly, searchable, permanent in ways that meant privacy was increasingly an illusion. I found her. She was indeed a therapist, based in San Francisco, specializing in what she called corporate trauma and systemic compliance. Her website had a bio that was careful not to mention any specific company or family, but the picture was unmistakably her, 30 years older but carrying herself with a calmness that suggested she'd made peace with something I was still struggling with. I didn't contact her. I looked at her photo, read her bio, understood that she'd built a life out of processing exactly the kind of things that were destroying me from the inside. And then I closed the browser and sat with that knowledge. I went back to work after my month of leave. I told everyone I was better. I said the time away had been good. I said I was ready to get back to what I did best. This was, from a certain perspective, true. I was ready. I was ready to do something at least. What I didn't know was that something was going to be the thing that ended my career at Rothstein & Cole. Or at least started the process of ending it. There was a project. There was always a project. We'd been engaged by a company called TechCorp Industries, a software manufacturing firm that had been struggling with market share and was looking for strategic advice on how to reposition itself for growth. This was my world. This was what I'd done for 30 years, and I was good at it. I understood how to take a struggling company and locate its leverage points, understand how to craft narratives about its future that would convince investors and boards that the path forward was clear. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Margaret's letter. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 30 years of small moral compromises. Maybe it was simply that I was 48 years old and I had started to suspect that I didn't have 30 more years to keep doing this. That the time I had left was limited and should perhaps be spent on something other than helping rich people get richer. The analysis came back, the one I was supposed to write. The recommendation was supposed to be that TechCorp should sell its assets to a larger corporation that I had specific reasons to know was structurally corrupt, run by people who had a pattern of dismantling companies, laying off workers, and extracting value for themselves at the expense of everyone else. This recommendation would make a lot of money for a lot of people. It would also destroy a company that had been operating successfully for 15 years, that employed 2,000 people, that had built something real. I didn't write it. Instead, I wrote a different recommendation. I wrote an analysis suggesting that TechCorp had significant value, that its problems were addressable, that a strategic reinvestment in research and development combined with a carefully managed reorganization could position the company for substantial growth. I wrote a recommendation that would be unprofitable for the people who needed it to be profitable. I sent the report to Richard Rothstein. I sent it to the other partners. I waited for the response. It came quickly. A meeting in Richard's office. The office was the same office he'd offered me scotch in when I was 19. The view was slightly better now. The building had been upgraded, but the essential geography was unchanged. Richard sat behind his desk. The other partners, 7 of them now, all older than me, all richer than me, all more powerful than me, stood in a semicircle around the room. "I'd like to understand what happened here," Richard said, holding up my report. "I wrote what I believe to be an accurate analysis," I said. "You wrote what you believe to be an accurate analysis," Richard repeated. "Not what we asked you to write, not what the data supports. What you believe." "Yes," I said. "Do you understand what that means?" Another partner asked. His name was Michael Chun. He joined the firm about 15 years after me, had proven himself to be particularly skilled at the mechanics of the deals Richard had taught me to facilitate. "Do you understand what it means to present an analysis that contradicts the instructions you've been given?" "I understand that it's my professional opinion based on the data available," I said. "Your professional opinion," Richard said, "is not what we're paying for. What we're paying for is analysis that serves our clients' interests as defined by our clients. TechCorp hired us to determine the best path forward. We determined, before we even began the analysis, what the path forward would be. Your job was to provide the evidentiary cover for that determination. Your job was to tell the story that we'd already decided to tell." "No," I said. "My job was to provide honest analysis." "That is not your job," Michael said quietly. "Your job has never been to provide honest analysis. Your job has been to be smart enough to understand what the desired outcome is and sophisticated enough to make that outcome look inevitable. That's what you've been good at. That's what you've been paid 30 years to be good at." I felt the weight of this settling into me, the understanding that I'd known this all along, that I'd been running a calculation every day for 30 years where I'd subtracted my integrity from my success and had decided that the difference was worth paying. But I'd been running this calculation so quietly, so methodically, that I'd been able to convince myself that I wasn't running it, that this wasn't actually what was happening. "And if I don't rewrite the report?" I asked. "Then you stop working here," Richard said simply. "Your employment with Rothstein and Cole is contingent on your ability to do this job. If you cannot do this job, then we no longer have a working relationship. It's that simple." I remember the silence that followed. I remember understanding with absolute clarity that this was a choice point, that I could walk out of this office and never come back, that I could, if I was willing to accept the financial and professional consequences, reclaim something of myself that I'd surrendered 30 years ago. I also remember understanding that I wasn't willing to accept those consequences. I was 48 years old. I had a mortgage on the penthouse apartment. I had become accustomed to a particular standard of living. I had built a life that was predicated on a certain level of income. I had relationships, or at least professional relationships, that were contingent on my continued success. And I was scared. I was scared of the unknown. I was scared of poverty. I was scared of starting over. I was scared of being invisible, irrelevant, a man in his late 40s with no current job prospects and a gap in his resume that would require explanation. "I'll rewrite it," I said. "Of course you will," Richard said. "That's who you are, Harrison. That's why we recruited you all those years ago. That's why I saw potential in you when you were 17 years old. You're the kind of person who will do what's necessary, who will make the hard choices, who will accept that success and integrity are often incompatible, and who will choose success." I rewrote the report. TechCorp was sold off over the next 18 months. The company was dismantled. The 2,000 employees were laid off. The assets were stripped and repurposed, and I received a bonus for my work. A substantial bonus, the kind of money that allowed me to pay off the mortgage on the penthouse apartment and buy a smaller place in the same building as an investment property. This is what success looked like from the inside. This is what I'd been building toward for 30 years. But something shifted after that. Not everything. Not overnight. But something. I didn't speak to Margaret again. She died before. I understood what she'd been trying to tell me, but I started paying attention to my complicity in a way I hadn't before. I started recognizing the mechanisms of the deals I was involved with, the specific violence of them, the human cost that was abstracted away by numbers and statistics and the language of necessity. I continued working at Rothstein & Cole for another 7 years. I was promoted. I became a partner myself. Eventually, just as Richard had predicted, I made more money. My compensation package included a percentage of the firm's profits. By any objective measure, I had achieved the life I'd set out to achieve. But the apartment I lived in felt like a tomb. The dinners at restaurants that required jackets felt like performances. The conversations with other partners about their vacation homes and their children's private school placements felt like a special language designed specifically to exclude me from genuine human connection. I was surrounded by people, and I was desperately, achingly alone. Sometime around my 52nd year, I was still at the firm at that point, still involved in deals, still telling the stories that made terrible things look rational. I started to understand what Margaret had meant, what she'd been trying to tell me, what Amber had been trying to warn me about. They understood, both of them, that this world I'd chosen to inhabit didn't have space for actual human meaning, that it was a machinery designed to convert integrity into profit, that every choice to participate was a choice to lose a little bit more of yourself, and that eventually, if you stayed long enough, if you complied enough, if you made enough of the hard choices, there wouldn't be anything left of you but the machinery itself. I left Rothstein & Cole 6 months ago. I told Richard the first was retiring. I told him I wanted to travel, to spend time on personal projects, to enjoy the fruits of my labor. This was technically true and entirely false. The truth was that I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore without seeing the 17-year-old who'd been recruited, the 19-year-old who'd been initiated into corruption, the hundreds of different versions of myself who'd made small compromises that had added up to a life that was fundamentally dishonest. Richard accepted my resignation with grace. He told me I'd earned my rest. He told me I was a valuable part of the firm's history and that my contributions would be remembered. He told me that the door was always open if I ever wanted to come back. He didn't say, but I knew what he was thinking, that I would be back, that the allure of money, of status, of power would eventually pull me back into the machinery, that people like me don't actually leave. We just take sabbaticals. But this time, I think he's wrong. This time, for the first time in my adult life, I don't think I'm going to come back. What I'm trying to do now, at 52 years old, is figure out how to reclaim the person I was before I was recruited. Or, if that person is genuinely gone, and I suspect they are, how to build a new person out of the wreckage. How to figure out what I actually believe in. How to learn what genuine integrity looks like. Not the word-of-mouth version that you repeat at dinner parties, but the actual lived experience of choosing what's right over what's profitable. I've been writing a lot. I've been reading things I didn't have time to read when I was focused on success. I've been visiting Amber, who agreed to see me after I reached out to her, and who has been gracious enough to listen to the accumulated weight of my complicity and to help me process it in ways that don't feel like I'm just adding to the burden I'm already carrying. She told me something, 6 months into our renewed contact, that has stayed with me. She said, "You know the thing about the machinery? It doesn't actually need your consent to work. It works whether you say yes or no. But if you say yes, if you cooperate, if you do the work that makes it function, then you become responsible. You become part of it. You become the thing that needs to be dismantled. Can it be dismantled? I asked. I don't know, she said honestly. Not from the inside, not by one person. But the act of stepping outside of it, of refusing to participate, that's something. That's how it starts. I think about Margaret's letter often now. I think about the fact that she wrote it despite knowing that it couldn't change the past, despite knowing that I couldn't undo the choices I'd made. She wrote it anyway, as an act of witness, as a way of saying, I saw what you did. I know what happened. I'm not going to let it disappear into silence. I think about Amber, 19 years old, trying to warn me, trying to tell me that the price of success would be measured in parts of myself that I would never get back. And I think about how I didn't listen, how I was too hungry for the validation that the machinery offered to hear the warning that she was trying to give me. I think about all the people at Rothstein and Cole, all the partners and consultants and administrators who are currently engaged in the work of converting human meaning into profit. I think about how many of them know what they're doing, how many of them are operating within some level of consciousness about the nature of the machinery they're part of, and how many of them, like I was for so long, are operating in a state of willful ignorance, telling themselves stories about inevitability and necessity and the way the world works, stories that allow them to sleep at night despite the weight they're carrying. I think about the 2,000 people who lost their jobs when TechCorp was dismantled. I think about their mortgages and their health insurance and their retirement plans. I think about the fact that their futures were destroyed so that I could get a bonus that I used to pay off a mortgage on an apartment I barely spent time in. I think about the arithmetic of that exchange and how profoundly unequal it was. And I think about the person I was before all of this. I think about the 17-year-old who'd been kind, who'd had integrity, who'd believed that doing the right thing was actually possible, that the world operated according to some kind of moral logic where good behavior had positive consequences and bad behavior had negative ones. I think about how much money I had to make, how much status I had to achieve, how many compromises I had to make in order to destroy that person. And I think about whether that exchange was worth it. I know the answer. I've always known the answer. But I've spent 30 years not thinking about the question, not allowing myself to really sit with it and consider what the answer meant about who I am and what I've become. What I know now, what Margaret's letter helped me understand, is that you can live a long time with a lie. You can build an entire life, an entire identity, an entire architecture of success on top of a fundamental dishonesty. And you can convince yourself that the lie is truth, that the dishonesty is just how the world works, that the machinery you're part of is inevitable and unchangeable. But it doesn't make the lie less of a lie. It doesn't make the dishonesty less corrupt. It doesn't make the machinery less destructive. It just means you've gotten very good at not looking directly at what you've done, at the cost you've extracted from others, at the cost you've extracted from yourself. I'm trying now to look directly. I'm trying to face what I've spent 30 years avoiding. I'm trying to understand what it means to be complicit, to acknowledge that complicity, and to figure out whether there's anything left of me that can be reclaimed or rebuilt into something that might actually be worth having on my deathbed. I don't know if there is. I don't know if you can undo 30 years of corruption with a few years of awareness and guilt and therapy. I don't know if the damage I've done to others can be mitigated by my personal recognition of that damage. I don't know if there's actually any way to make this right, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to figure it out, because Margaret's letter deserves that, because Amber's warning, delivered when she was 19 years old and I was too young and too hungry to listen, deserves that acknowledgement, because the 2,000 people who lost their jobs deserve that recognition. And because the person I was before I was recruited deserves the chance to be mourned, to be acknowledged, to have their destruction treated as the tragedy it actually is. 30 years. That's how long it took me to understand what I should have understood at 17. When I first walked into a room that was designed specifically to corrupt me, to recruit me, to turn me into a tool that could be used to extract value from other people's vulnerability. 30 years. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the real reason the letter came when it did. Not to change the past is fixed, unchangeable, immutable, but to remind me that I still have time, that 52 is not the end, that I still have a future available to me, one where I'm not trapped in the machinery, one where I can reclaim at least some version of integrity, even if I can never undo the damage I've done. That's what I'm going to do now. That's my project. That's the only thing that feels like it might actually matter. The city outside my window keeps moving. The machinery keeps functioning. The next generation of young men and women are being recruited into the system, being offered the same promises I was offered, being given the same tests to see if they're willing to sacrifice their integrity for success. Some of them will refuse. Some of them will walk away. Some of them will understand, from the beginning, the nature of the deal they're being offered. But most of them will be like I was. They'll be smart. They'll be hungry. They'll be vulnerable to the particular seduction of being chosen, of being told that they have exceptional potential, of being offered a future that's already been perfectly designed for them. And they'll say yes. They'll take the bait, as Amber said. They'll walk into the machinery. And they'll spend 30 years or 40 years or 50 years discovering that the success they've achieved is built on a foundation of compromises they didn't fully understand, on a cost they were never quite willing to fully calculate. But at least now, at least at this point in my life, I can see it. I can name it. I can acknowledge what's happened. I can stop pretending that the machinery is something other than what it is. I can stop telling myself stories about how it's all for the greater good, how it's just how the world works, how it's inevitable, and maybe that's the only redemption available to me. Not undoing the past, but refusing to perpetuate the lie that the past was anything other than what it was. Not making the damage I've done disappear, but acknowledging it, recognizing it, allowing it to be visible. That's what I'm doing now. That's what I'm going to do for whatever time remains. Margaret's letter sits in a drawer in my apartment. I read it sometimes, not often, but enough to remind myself of what she was trying to tell me. And I think about how long she carried that knowledge, how long she carried the weight of my complicity alongside her own, how long she waited for me to be ready to hear what she had to say. I'm ready now. I'm finally, at 52 years old, ready to hear it. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that she gave me the chance to understand, before it was too late, that there are different ways to measure a life, that success and integrity are not the same thing, that it's possible to wake up and decide that you're going to do things differently. That's where I am now. That's the real reason everything changed. 30 years it took me to discover this. 30 years of construction before I finally saw the architecture of what I'd built and understood that I didn't want to live in it anymore. Now I get to figure out what I build next. Now I get to imagine what a life might look like if it was built on something other than the foundation of compromised ideals and extracted profit. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. I don't know if I'm actually capable of building something real at this stage of my life. But I know I have to try. I know I owe that to Margaret. I know I owe that to Amber. I know I owe that to the people whose futures I've altered or destroyed in service of my own success. And I know I owe it to the 17-year-old Harrison Blake, the one who still existed before he was recruited, before he was initiated, before he made the first of 1,000 compromises that would compound into a life he didn't recognize when he finally looked at it clearly. That's his name in the mirror now. That's who I'm trying to become again. Not because I think I can erase the past, but because the future is still available, and unlike some people, unlike Margaret, who ran out of time, I still have enough of it left to do something with it. That's the real thing I discovered after 30 years. That's the reason behind everything. That's what the machinery has been teaching me, whether I wanted to learn it or not.